morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and founder of Tortoise, and as you'll know now, for well more than a year, we've been hosting these conversations. We were reflecting as we were just getting together here that this is a conversation that's about one of the more difficult aspects of business today, but frankly, given where we thought we might be a year ago, it's a problem we'd rather have than many of the problems we could be having. It's about the labour shortages and the struggles that businesses are facing, trying to find people to fill the jobs that sorely needed to be filled. And I'm delighted that Mark Staniland from Hayes is here and Sandra Mackenzie-Day from Seva Logistics. I'm going to come to you, Mark and Sandra, in a moment. But I'm going to start, if I might, with Rain Newton-Smith. Everyone on the call today will know Rain, the chief economist of the CBI. And Rain, I wonder, before we get into the kind of weeds of the labour market, we could just start with a big picture on opening back up. It feels like we're on track now, doesn't it, for July the 19th? So will you tell us a little bit about how you, the CBI, what you're hearing from business and government in terms of preparation for that date?
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who were celebrating in England last night, I hope you've all recovered. It took us quite a while in this household to calm down, I have to say, from last night's excitement. But yeah, James, as you were saying, we heard on Monday from Sajid Javid, the new health secretary, that the UK remains on track for that reopening on July 19th. It won't be any earlier than that, and that all should be confirmed on the 12th of July, and when we should also get, importantly, the reviews back on social distancing and COVID status certification, which will be very important for businesses. I'm sure many businesses will say 1 week isn't quite enough to digest all that, but we will be there hopefully to guide you through that process. We'll have a webinar on the 14th of July going through those announcements and how businesses can prepare for what will hopefully be one of the final stages of our reopening. I think the second area that, obviously we've seen more on recently and remains a big concern for us is the aviation sector and international tourism. And I think we did get the sort of updates on international travel, but I think it was a little bit disappointing, definitely, for the aviation sector. In particular, we haven't seen much movement on the green list, in particular of countries. And I think particularly when we've had conversations, there's a feeling as well that the UK is a bit behind where some other countries are on, just accepting double vaccination, the sharing of data on vaccination certificates and that sort of opening up across borders and opening up safe travel corridors. And so I think the message continues to be to government, we need to have a risk-based approach. We need to have a transparency of the data that's being used to guide those systems, and the more that we can safely open up at least some routes is just so important, not just for travel but for exports, for cargo, for everything, for people, but also our connections with the world. And I suppose, speaking around connections with the world, the other issue that we've continued to be working through is around the Northern Ireland protocol, and Tony met with Maros Sefcovic, who is the VP at the European Commission for International Relations, and just talking through. I think our message again is really we need calm heads, we need pragmatism, and it's just really important that we get the business engagement and negotiation to really make the protocol work, because it's so important for business in Northern Ireland. But of course, I think it's quite sensible, James, and this may be where you're about to sort of take us to just segue into the overall outlook on the economy, which I think is a natural, point. Did I get there first?
You did, because I was going to say firstly, I was going to sort of congratulate you, Rain, because I remember when I was at the FT, I was told there was a surprising correlation between England's progress in international football competitions, consumer confidence, and quarterly performance of GDP numbers. So I wanted to say to you, well, congratulations on your economics clairvoyance, because I think 10 days ago, a couple of weeks ago, the CBI kind of significantly upgraded the forecast for 2021. And I just think before we get into labour market shortages, it's quite good to get some context, isn't it, of why you're thinking that way and what prompted you to actually make that upgrade.
Yeah, so I mean, we expect to see growth of over 8% this year and over 6% next year. And I think I'd like to say it's our prescience, but actually I think it's partly from having a forecast that is most current out there from the big forecasters, like the OBR, which was quite a few months ago, and the Bank of England a couple of months ago. And what we've just seen is, one, the hugely successful rollout of the vaccine is really translating into strong consumer confidence. At each stage, as the economy has opened, as that sector has opened, we've seen a bounce in people spending in shops and restaurants. So actually, we saw slightly softer retail sales in essential shops because people were going out to pubs and cafes and restaurants. And so pretty much across the space, we're seeing strong economic activity. One of the big engines of growth this year is still government spending, partly as, through the strength of all the government programs to help businesses through the pandemic. But essentially, we're just seeing that strong household spending, which will really drive growth this year. And even though it takes longer for business investment to recover, we're still seeing stronger investment intentions. And when I talk to businesses, across sectors, I would say, apart from some of the really challenging issues around sectors that depend on international tourism and aviation, we're seeing strong growth across the board. So I think there are some real positives, and we can see it even in our latest growth indicator, which even supersedes our forecast. So yeah, we're really seeing that strength in the wider economy.
So well, let's get to the heart of the conversation for today. And to a certain extent, there's often these conversations we have, Rain, where, if you like, the CBI is listening to the points of view of business. In this case, some people on the call may not have seen, but actually the CBI on Monday came out and distilled quite a lot of what you've heard in a point to the government about the relaxation or the refinement of post-Brexit immigration rules to deal with some of these shortages. So will you just speak to that, what the CBI's ask is and what's driving that thinking?
Yeah, so I think, and even stepping back from that, I really think I can remember when I first started at the CBI 7 years ago. Even then, one of the biggest, the most common issue for businesses around the country was around sort of skills shortages. So I think we've always seen a sort of structural challenge. And people sort of said that the thing that holds me back from growing my business is finding the right talent to grow that business, whether that's at either end of the sort of the spectrums in the labor market. And then I think, of course, what we've seen is, having left the European Union, that's had an impact on the ease of immigration between the UK and the rest of Europe. And also, I think particularly more recently, you layer that on with a pandemic, when a lot of people who were working and living here in the early phase of the pandemic wanted to travel home and be with their families and relatives. And one of the challenges is we haven't seen some of those migrants from across the rest of Europe come back to the UK. And now some of that is Brexit, but of course some of that is the pandemic. And I think at one point that I should get across before we dive into the wider policy is, actually today is the last day, the deadline for the EU settlement scheme. So there are so many, policy issues that need to get done as part of forging that new relationship. And that means that any employer needs to make sure that any new recruits from the European Economic Area have done their online immigration status. They've done those checks to ensure their right to work. So if individuals don't apply by today, they might lose the right to live and work in the UK. So it's quite an important deadline, and employers have to do the right checks. But actually, it's beholden on the individuals to do that settlement status. And I think, look, I think what we know from the businesses we speak to, and we'll come on to this, is finding people at both ends of the spectrum is really important. And the government do have this a list of shortage occupations,
Yeah.
but what we find is those are out of date. They need to be updated much more frequently. and it's good we've got a system for higher skilled immigration to come into the UK, but we need to have a system that's much more efficient, that works better, and also thinks about, I don't like calling it the lower end of the labour market. I think everyone has skills that they are bringing to the table, but what we do know is obviously our immigration system is based on points and on levels of qualification, but there are lots of skills that we need where people have less qualifications, but they are still skilled workers, and we need them here to help grow businesses, and we need a system that works at that end of the labour market as well.
Well, I'd love to hear from Mark and Sandra about this, because actually the thing that really surprised me about the CBI's intervention at the beginning of the week was exactly as you say, was just quite the range of different businesses that were saying they were facing skill shortages and the kinds of skills that were needed. So it wasn't, just what we've heard for years, IT specialists, coders, etc. You're talking about bakers, builders, the whole butchers, the whole range of things. And I mean, just to give everyone who's joining us on the call a sense of how we hope this works. The great thing about these conversations is that we can hear from people. Like the CBI's aim in this is to try and hear as much as possible from business, so do weigh in. I mean, I just picked up a point that's made by Tony Gujar of the Association of Independent Meat Suppliers, who just says really bluntly, labour shortages are rampant in the food industry. There's a lack of drivers, lack of processing operatives, lack of vets in livestock processing. I mean, it's really, really striking. So Mark Staniland, can I start with you, if I might? Presumably at Hayes, you have quite a sensitivity to where these shortages are. Can you give us, if you like, the lie of the land, where you're seeing the most acute shortages, and if possible, a sense of why?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to answer because there's so many sectors where there are shortages. So in our industries, we're seeing shortages in construction, life sciences, engineering, finance, technology, and it's very much across the board. So I think Rain's point, which is that there is a need to constantly update the shortage list, is the most relevant one. It's a really moving feast, and I think one of the areas of expertise on your list in the construction industry was bricklayers. And that is very much on the money. There is a real shortage of skilled labour in the construction industry at the moment, pent up demand, and major projects across the UK starting to take place. And those skills we just don't have enough of those skills out there at the moment. So James, the skill shortage is very much across the board. It's in all different sectors, and we're reliant on that because our sort of long-term planning for skilled shortages in the UK hasn't quite worked. And I think what we need is a long-term plan which does work. And I don't want to throw stones here at plans of the past, but as Rain said, we've been talking about skill shortages for 10 years.
Yeah.
And I always feel with this, we're looking for a click of the finger solution, and that's why we turn to the international community, because that's where we can find our solution right now. But really, the heart of this is a long-term plan, which is going to work. And as well as talking about the shortages now, we really have got to get to grips with that long-term plan.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, Mark. We had, where Rain and I sat together, one of the last occasions actually we were all actually in the sort of similar space, was at the CBI's annual conference, and one of the themes that came across most strongly there was skills. And then when Tony Danker and I were doing the CBI at 10 last week, and we were talking about the levelling up agenda, again, it was exactly the same thing, question of skills in the Northeast. I suppose, just to press you a little bit on what you think that longer term answer is. We've obviously seen in the last decade actually real term cuts in FE spending and some of the investments in skills. What do you think that needs to be? I mean, I'm going to come to Sandra in a moment about the sort of near term recruitment answers to this, but the longer term answers are what?
Yeah, again, you know, if there was a silver bullet, somebody would have found it. I think, you know, the government has invested money. If you take the apprentice levy, well, you know, I think at the time we all went, right, fair enough, this is uncomfortable, not sure, but, you know, let's do this. And so billions of pounds is raised for apprenticeships. And you know, again, it's not a black and white thing. There are lots of really good success stories out there with the apprentice levy, but equally, I think there's been a lot of criticism that it hasn't quite generated the number of apprenticeships that you wanted to see for the amount of revenue that went there. So that's one area. There's an awful lot we need to do to, you know, the long-term plan is how do we get into schools? How do we really engage the future generation? You know, and I know the CBI has done an awful lot of good work there. There's a lot of good work that goes on there. So you point to all these things and, you know, there's a lot of really good stuff that's going on. But 5 or 6 years later, the whole thing just doesn't seem to be delivering on all the skills that we need. And it is a long-term plan, because the skill shortages that we see are at middle management and senior management.
Right. Yeah.
A lot. So you can't, you know, and that's where you end up going back to the international problem, the international source. So yeah, this long-term solution that we need is there's a multifarious aspects to that plan. And it needs to be joined up, and we need to go, what is it going to look like in 5, 6, 7 years time? You know, what is the, you know, the current strategy that the government has for job support? Because, you know, I think in answer to the CBI drive for international for the shortage areas, the response was, well, we're doing lots now to support jobs in the world of work, but is that plan going to deliver what we need in 5 years time?
It's interesting, by the way, Mark, you mentioned the apprenticeships levy. Just as you were speaking, Tony Gucci, who made the point about the shortages in the food industry, was saying actually in terms of Kickstart that they were advising a lot of their members to use Kickstart, a lot of which are successful, but then also quite a few cases where people don't show up or leave after a few days. So the monitoring of these programs that are in place is also really, really key.
Yes.
Sandra, can I get a sense from you? Can we start with actually just the CEVA logistics business itself? Are there specific areas where you're like, good grief, you just don't have the people?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Mark highlighted kind of that middle to senior management group. For us, it is much more what I'd consider to be our frontline colleague area, where we see the struggle, not just in CEVA but in our industry. So for us, along with the person that mentioned the question, then it's our driver population, it's our warehouse colleague population. And if you think about, you know, I suppose our industry more generally, last year we saw enormous growth, not least because we were all at home shopping online rather than out in shops. But, you know, we saw growth of, I think, something like 46% in the e-com sector alone. Well, that is all driven by drivers delivering goods into a warehouse and then somebody moving boxes and getting them back out the door to us as individuals at home. So I think for us, it is definitely the more frontline role that our industry is struggling, and that's not just drivers for logistics, that's drivers in the food industry as your questionnaire mentioned. It's across the board, and there just simply isn't enough drivers. And so, as Mark said, we have always looked internationally to fill those gaps. And the gaps that we have in the industry, these are long-term systemic gaps around license acquisition, attractiveness of the industry, etc. And what's happened, of course, is with Brexit and the turning off of that labour market to us in Europe, is it's actually just highlighted and really pushed to the forefront the issues that the industry have. And you know, at the moment, perhaps we're not seeing the full effects on supply chains, but you know, Tesco's, I think just at the weekend, tail end of last week, you know, announcing that they were seeing, you know, having trouble getting food onto shelves because they simply did not have enough drivers. And that's the reality of it. You know, if you don't have enough drivers, you physically can't move your product around the country.
And Sandra, a very clumsy explanation of this is Brexit. People who either didn't come to the country after the 2016 vote or chose over time to leave the country, and then pandemic, where, you know, people went, quote unquote, back to their home countries, a big exodus, and certainly in certain parts of the country, and then a third, which is people changing their lifestyles in the course of the last sort of that those three things: Brexit, pandemic, lifestyle choices. Is that because I know that you have responsibility across Europe? Are you seeing similar patterns across Europe, or is the UK particularly acute?
It's particularly acute, and there are a couple of other, I suppose, reasons for that, including the ones that you've just mentioned. You know, the IR35 regulations, for example, that has hit kind of our self-employed subcontractor population particularly hard. So that is one big thing that is hit. You know, a lot of our our self-employed drivers out in the industry made themselves put themselves on furlough themselves last year. So you know, you had those people stepping back from the industry, not moving. You had no tests happening last year because of course everything stopped and was suspended. So the few new drivers that come onto the market, they weren't there. And then we just have this systemic issue in our industry about license acquisition. You know, it's an expensive business for somebody entering into the business, entering into our industry. It's anywhere between £2,000 and £5,000 it can cost an individual to get their license. So from an attractiveness of entry into our industry, it's hard. And then, you know, if you look at, I suppose, our longer term plans, as Mark indicated, things like the apprenticeship levy, actually as an industry, you know, we contribute an awful lot, but I think it's only something like 7% of the overall levy is spent in industry, in logistics in the UK. So I think whilst I think we have all of the foundations of the solutions, so schools, apprenticeships, there is something much more practical that isn't working. And for apprenticeships, I think that's probably to do with the bureaucracy that sits around them. You know, for big organisations like ours, where we're able to have structures that can manage apprentices in large numbers, that's brilliant. But that's not everybody's story. You know, our medium, smaller organisations find navigating through the apprenticeship world difficult. It's hard, and therefore, sorry.
No, go on. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, but finish your point. Sorry.
I was going to say they find it hard to navigate through. You know, it's difficult to find providers. It's difficult to fund. It's difficult. You know, it's tough to navigate yourself through the actual bureaucracy of having an apprentice. Not least because, you know, 20% of their time needs to be off the job, and for a smaller organisation, that's a huge investment. That's 20% a day of somebody's working week where they're not actually being productive in the sense of the business.
And the disruption for everyone else, of course.
Of course, yeah.
Sandra, can I just understand one thing? You touched on it really briefly in that sort of list of points, which was furlough and IR35. Actually, Mike Beasley made the same point in the chat. Said, isn't the current position made worse by the continuation of furlough plus the impacts of IR35? Can we just get into that in a bit of detail? The job retention scheme furlough is coming to an end, so I wonder what you think the impact of that is. And can you just talk through this point on IR35 so people understand it clearly, the extent to which that's disincentivizing people from behaving in a more sort of flexible way in the labour market?
Yeah. So I suppose we touch on furlough. You know, there is absolutely two sides to the furlough debate. There's no getting away from it. You know, for individuals who might have been at risk of losing their jobs, and organisations that wanted to retain their talent through a period of reduction of their own workflow, it makes perfect sense. You know, and there's probably still an argument for that to continue, and I get that. I think if you're not in that position and actually you're trying to attract new people into your organisation, the fact that there is still a proportion of the workforce at arm's length to us is difficult. So you know, it's a hard debate to call that. You know, it depends on your particular situation and your business and your industry. So if I speak about IR35, so IR35, you know, everybody will know about it. It's a piece of tax legislation that essentially closed the door on you know, being a self-employed driver if you didn't meet certain criteria. So what it meant for us as an industry, and it was quite, I suppose it's quite a seismic change for the logistics industry and for drivers in particular, because it was a hugely advantageous tax break for individuals that typically, are not massively well paid. So this was something that was an added advantage and kept those individuals in the industry, because it simply made being a driver more attractive. They were able to earn more. Simple. So when that legislation finally came into effect in the private sector, I know it'd been in the public sector for some time, what we saw immediately is people leaving and shedding the industry. That was the time at which they decided they simply just didn't want to drive anymore. They simply couldn't earn what they had been earning, and therefore decided to exit the industry. So that is the real impact of IR35. Whether you have an opinion on the tax implications and whether you have an opinion on whether there should be tax loopholes for certain groups, the reality is it's had quite a disastrous effect on the driver population.
Sandra, thank you. Rain, can I ask you two questions? This is in your sort of role as kind of head of the crystal ball department, right? The two questions are, one is, and Josh Burley makes this point, which is about wage inflation. So listening to Mark and Sandra, you would just think, and actually, fun enough, listening to your forecast for the economy, you'd think all of those things point to a degree of inflation. And so I wondered, A, what you thought about the likelihood of that. And secondly, I'm just struck listening to Mark and Sandra too about the shape of the labour market. We talk about shortages of drivers and a new kind of market where you're getting logistics fulfillment of online retail. I don't know about you, but the overwhelming number of people who knock on the door every day are men, Marcus, and I wonder whether or not you're going to see a change in who's employed in terms of gender, in terms of age, in terms of geography, and whether there's any work being done yet on the shape of the labour market that comes out of this.
Yeah, so a couple of really big questions there. Maybe I'll take the question first on sort of inflation and wage inflation. I would say what we're seeing at the moment is these really tight, really acute skill shortages in certain sectors of the labour market. So HGV drivers, really important case in point, and I really agree with some of the points that was made in the chat. I couldn't get into an HGV vehicle and and do what a driver does. It is a skilled role. Currently on the government's classification, it fits under skill level 2, which means that it can't, we can't go outside of the UK to bring those skills in. But I think everyone agrees it is a skilled role, and I think we need to be more open-minded about what that means, and we need to be able to attract those skills from other countries when we see the acute shortages we see at the moment. But generally, in terms of inflation, what we aren't yet seeing this translate into what I will call sort of wage settlement. So people are looking across their entire workforce and saying, actually, this year we're going to have to give, wage settlement significantly above the current level of inflation. I think we might get to that stage. We might, and I think everyone knows that inflationary pressures are likely to pick up from where they are now, and they're much higher than they were 6 months ago. But I think we're still unlikely to see really, a return to, I guess, those of us who are a little bit older, I'm not quite, think about the sort of 80s and periods where we saw really high inflation in the UK. I don't think we're going back to those days. There are structural reasons why global inflation is low and is likely to stay low for a while. And obviously the Bank of England has a lot of room for maneuver to tackle inflation. So I think what we're seeing is these, real stickiness in parts of the economy as we reopen up. It's not surprising, right, that demand and supply aren't moving completely in sync as we reopen from what we've never had to deal with on the economy. And you layer a sort of a new relationship with the EU, a post-Brexit world onto that at the same time, and we're going to see challenges and on top of some of the structural issues we've seen already. Maybe I'll stop there because I can see Mark's coming in. I don't think I quite dealt with your second question, James.
Mark, I'll come to you in 1 second, but do you have a view, Rain, on what happens in terms of labour market shape, whether or not this kind of these shortages play better for men, women, younger,
Yeah,
old?
I mean, I think it's still a little bit too early to say. I think globally, what we do know, and the IMF have done work around this, has this pandemic across the labor market globally hit women worse than men? Yes, it has, right? And there was a huge issue, and even we could see that in the UK around like who was more likely to be furloughed, more likely to be furloughed if you are older, more likely to be furloughed if you are female. And I think some of that was also about caring responsibility. And some of that was also, you know, people putting them forward and saying, look, I can't homeschool and work at the same time. Please, can you put me on furlough? And employers, you know, giving, you know, allowing, giving preferential treatment around that just to help, you know, people make it through this pandemic. I think there's a question as we come out of that. Obviously, there was concerns around, you know, when hairdressers, if I think about smaller female-run businesses, a lot of those businesses were impacted by the closures. But now that we're reopening, I'm not sure that we will see such a gender stratification. And I think in some sense, I am more optimistic because we're just seeing growth across so many different sectors now at the moment that actually we may not see, you know, a lasting impact on gender from the pandemic. But it's something we definitely do have to look out for.
Rain, thank you. Mark, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I was just going to say that you know, wage inflation is on an upward trajectory. Go on, see and you know, we are seeing that. So I think at the back end of last year, our salary survey saw wage inflation at about 3%, but anecdotally and in line with latest government data, we're seeing it at about 5% at the moment.
Wow.
So definitely on the move. And in terms of what employees are looking for, pay has always remained in all our surveys at around the sort of 35 to 40% mark as the priority, number one priority of what they're looking for when they move. And therefore, I do think I would say to all employers that making sure that you've got competitive salaries and that you're aware of the salaries in your various markets is very important in terms of attracting and retaining people.
So, and Mark and Sandra, actually, I'd love to actually spend the last sort of 15 minutes that we've got just focused on that, because there'll be people who I think joining us today think, well, look, I can't do anything about IR35, I can't do anything about the pandemic or Brexit. What I can do is figure out the best strategy for finding the best people in these circumstances. And so, Mark, will you just, and Sandra, I'm going to come to you on the same subject. So what's your advice on how you do that?
Yeah, well, I think it's good to know what's going on out in the world. First of all, things are, you know, we're in probably the most dynamic change period of the workplace that we've experienced, certainly in my lifetime. So some of the dynamics are changing and some are remaining the same. So if you do a survey as we do on what people are looking for when they move, pay will tend to come out at the front end, probably inevitably. It's what puts the roof over your head. But after that, the sands are shifting slightly, and the big one, perhaps no surprise here now, is the flexibility and work-life balance aspect that people are looking for when they're moving jobs. So the percentage response of people who put that as a number one priority has moved significantly. So it's about 25% of people we surveyed recently said knowing what an organisation's policy is towards flexibility and what their policy towards hybrid working is going to be is now very high on the priority list. And then the other big one is what is your organisation offering me? That organisations now need to really speak very clearly about what the offer is to employees, because it's a very competitive market. Candidates are getting multiple offers. I therefore think there's a two-way thing, which is, you know, what is the employee looking for? He's looking for a very clear, she's looking for a very clear strategy as to what the opportunity and the career holds, and the employer needs to be aware that it's a very competitive market, and to sell themselves to the potential employee.
Mark, thanks. So how do you think about it?
So I would agree with all that Mark has said. I think there are nuances. Mark talked a bit about the construction industry. Obviously, I'm here as a representative of the logistics industry, but there'll be other industries, retail, etc., where agile working is absolutely the way forward, of course, and work-life balance is something we would all strive for as employers. However, the reality is we need somebody to move something in a warehouse. They can't do that from home. They need to be at work. In a retail setting, somebody needs to be in a shop to open the shop and to serve customers. So I think that point of agile working is really critical, but it affects a proportion of the market, not everything. And so I think, therefore, the points that Mark made about what is that makes us different as employers is really important. How do we stand out from the market, but also where do we go looking for people? So we've seen a massive shift, of course, out of the high street, out of retail, physical shops. Those places all employed people. So how do we attract somebody that perhaps might have worked in Debenhams to come and work in our warehouse? How do we do that? And as an industry or industries that perhaps are either less known about or less sexy, dare I say, we need to make sure that we're lifting the lid on them and showing people that wouldn't have considered us what we're about. Logistics isn't just about moving boxes. Actually, we're highly automated environments these days that don't require that physical impact, and therefore, actually, if you worked in a retail environment, you might consider coming and working for us. But would you have known that unless we make the effort to tell you? So I think, as employers and as industries that fall into those categories, we need to ensure that we're making the effort to really open the lid, advertise ourselves, share what our industries are about, and the reality of what it's like to work in them. So for me, it's about attracting a different type of employee, a different type of profile than perhaps what we would have relied on previously. And then, as Mark absolutely said, what differentiates us from the market? What is it that we can offer colleagues joining us that are going to make us not just want to join us and stay with us for a short period of time, but are going to want to have a sustained career with us? Because, of course, that's the second element. Attracting new employees is great, but you've got to hang on to them as well and make sure the head isn't turned by somebody else. So for me, it's a two-prong attack: looking elsewhere, going to market with a slightly different profile in mind than you would have done previously, but then hanging on and making sure that you look after your colleagues and look after your staff so that you want to stay with you for a sustained period of time.
Can I just put to you one question, which is, so for example, Sarah Mancy actually comments, Mark, that she's hearing a lot of people saying something similar. What staff are asking for is a better work-life balance. We're employing a lot more staff working shorter shifts, numbers of days, which I think is really interesting. But there's this question from Tom Hadley, which I think is interesting, Sandra, if I might put to you, which is, what innovation are we seeing in terms of hiring criteria and procedures? So, for example, employers hiring more on attitude and potential rather than on past experience. Is there a need for a big shift in the way in which employers recruit?
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes to that point of looking at a different profile of employee than you perhaps would have done previously. So I think it's probably something, and Mark probably would agree that it's a trend that's been happening pre-COVID, current labour issues. That actually the desire to find the right behaviours in an individual much more than perhaps their previous success at doing the same sort of job. I think that's an absolutely fair point. I think what you're starting to see, however, is actually that feeding much more firmly into recruitment selection processes, and therefore you're having entirely blind recruitment processes. So that means that automated process where perhaps actually you're not being interviewed even by somebody, but by a blank screen that's throwing questions at you. So we're starting to see definitely a shift towards technology that takes away the bias as employers to speak to people that have done the job before, because we simply don't have that choice anymore.
And Mark, you mentioned the senior management and middle management. Is that largely a reflection of sort of the focus or the primary focus of the work that Hays is doing, or do you think that there are actually, we talked about sectors, but actually whether or not within businesses themselves there's a pattern to market shortages? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, I am on mute.
There you are.
There we are. Yeah, I think it's a reflection of our focus to an extent, which Sandra pointed out earlier. You know, there's the sort of different areas that we each deal with. So are prevalent across all the markets that we work in. I think I just go back to a point actually on the retention side, if I could do before we run out of time, and that is the couple of things that we're seeing that's very different in the market that we weren't seeing pre-COVID, and that is a lot of people are joining companies now remotely. They've been interviewed remotely, they've been offered remotely, and they're joining. And the big change that we're seeing is when people join companies, there's a very significant increase in the fallout rate when people are in organisations in the first few months, and it increased by about 50% in the first quarter of this year. So one of the things that I would urge people to focus on, and Sandra and I were talking about it briefly before the call, and that is their onboarding processes. We've actually seen a reduction in Q2 because I think actually the market's responded and realised what's going on. But one of the recommendations I would make is your onboarding process and immersing people in the culture of your organisation when they're working on a remote basis is absolutely critical towards retaining people and making sure you've done all the hard work of recruiting people, that you don't lose them when they come in.
It's really interesting to see that I had a friend who had an absolutely terrible experience joining a company, remotely recruited, joined, left entirely at sea, just didn't know what she was doing, and no one. And then this culture builds up very quickly, which is you don't know what you're doing, you're blamed for the fact you're doing it right.
If you do a great job with that, you are really marking yourselves out at the moment. I do think, you know, having that as part of your recruitment process as well, which is again, this is how we onboard you, this is how we'll bring you into our organisation. It's you know, kind of early on in the process.
Just out of interest, Mark, did you dig into the numbers? Did you find that big increase in remote recruitment and the dropout rate was companies saying we got the wrong person, we're firing them, or was it the people joining?
No.
They're dropping out.
Employee led. Yeah. Yeah, they weren't engaged in the organisation when they went in. Yeah,
it's so
rather than employee-led. Yeah.
Mark and Sandra, thank you very much indeed. Rain, I just wanted to give you the last word if I could. One thing was we haven't really checked in on what you think the government's likely response on this point about immigration is, and particularly, you know, the shortage list, the skill shortage list. Do you get the impression that Bayes and government is quite sympathetic to that argument?
I think they're concerned about it. Whether they're willing to act on it is a different question. And I think our determination is, you know, we're not going to let this one go. We just see it as so important, and we're just hearing it more and more from companies. So, you know, a plea to all the businesses out there: the more you can give us case studies about the challenges you're facing as you are trying to grow your business, the more powerful we are able to go with so many different to government. And I think we need to see an annual review, if not sooner than that, around the shortages list. And we need a much more, I think, open-minded approach from government about what skills really means. And then I think the second part, where we haven't touched on but really needs to be a big focus of government and business, is about, you know, adult reskilling and retraining. And, you know, we think we need to see a lifetime skills guarantee so everyone gets a certain amount of training. So it's about apprenticeships, but it's much broader than that. And I think only if we get that focus from business and government, both around, you know, open to talent from around the world, but also building our talent and allowing people to transition between roles, between industries, that's the only way we're going to solve this over the long term.
Well, Rain, thank you very much indeed. on Monday, we're back. CBI at 10 is on Monday, where we're going to be talking about cash flow and financial support, and we've got Dame Theresa Graham joining us in the HMRC, so I think that will be a subject of great deal of interest. I wanted to say a big thank you to Sandra Mackenzie-Day of SEVA and Mark Staniland of Hayes. And Rain, I'm going to just finish off by saying what I think is possibly the best chat comment we've had today, which comes from Tony Guja, who made the first one, which is, he said, my suggestion to the panel: if you see a turkey in the freezer cabinet of your local supermarket, buy it now and keep it for Christmas. We're unlikely to have sufficient seasonal poultry workers for the turkey processing sector. Happy Christmas to you all. Happy Christmas to you, June 30th, and have a very good rest of your day. Thanks, Nathan.
All right,
you.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.